So we've got Senator Kim Carr, who's the Shadow Minister for the Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Industry, and also the Shadow Minister assisting the Leader for Science. Senator Carr, during his time, also was the first Minister for Innovation, Industry, Science and Research in the Labor government in 2007, and has been a staunch advocate and defender for universities and research in general. So it gives me great pleasure in welcoming Kim Carr to the stage. Thanks, Kim.
Thank you very much. I'll start again. Look, I wasn't the first minister in the Labor government. I was the first minister in the Commonwealth on innovation. I say that because this idea that somehow or another we've entered this new era is not entirely to be seen in context of the facts. In previous conversations I've had with Science Meets Parliament, I've argued that if you want to look at the relationship between science and politics, there are some pretty fundamental principles that apply. And I think in politics, the fundamental idea is that it's about who gets what, when and why. And I've made this point to you in the past, and I think it holds true today as much as it ever has. And it is also true that in recent times we've seen changes in the political dialogue in this country as a result of changes in personnel. We've seen changes that I'm sure many of you would have welcomed, if you're like anyone in this country, welcomed a fundamental shift from Tony Abbott to Malcolm Turnbull. There was a great sense of relief when that happened and high expectations of what could be achieved. That was 6 months ago. And we're now seeing a fundamental shift in that attitude as well, as people do question whether or not the expectations were justified. And I think given that what happened under Tony Abbott with the very savage reductions in the budget, $3 billion in science, innovation, research, $12 billion from our universities. That's what the policy remains. It's what was put together from the 2014 budget. It is not surprising that people would have a sense of relief that maybe all of that will change. Well, the reality, of course, is that it hasn't changed. Now, I'm a firm believer in the old adage that if you want to understand things in politics, you should follow the money. And I think that also remains the case. What we saw, of course, is in the Abbott period, a overt anti-scientific, climate change sceptic view, a hostility to basic research, and I think all of that was thought to have moved when we had a change. What we have seen is a fundamental shift in rhetoric, not in policy. And that's something that ought to be judged carefully. I've also said to you in the past that if you want to get a change in the finances of science, then you had to make science a political issue. And that's what's happening now. And I do think it's of great importance, and I certainly welcome it. Now, we need to acknowledge, and I acknowledge, that the statements that were made last December in regard to the innovation statement, as Professor Chubbs highlighted to you, had some very, very good elements to them. But I'll also remind you of what the President of the Business Council, Catherine Livingstone, said, where she pointed out to us, we have seemed to have gone from the word innovation being banned to suddenly being compulsory regardless of context. And she cautioned, and if we don't start taking a systems approach, we'll be effectively deciding how to style the rooms without having built the house. And I think that's wise counsel. We simply need to acknowledge, while the changes have occurred, they have not been in the context of a broad understanding of what we're trying to achieve. And I think the advertisements we see on TV highlight that. You know, it's one of the biggest things that's come out of that innovation statement was an advertising campaign. And that was about an ideas boom. But what was the idea that was supposed to boom? And it strikes me that while it's important to promote the positive things, we need to actually develop a much fuller understanding of what's required from the Commonwealth of Australia. Much of what was actually said, I might remind you, in December was in fact mimicking of announcements that the Labor Party had made. The things that were missing were the fundamental commitment to a substantial reinvestment in science and innovation. Now, Bill Shorten last night reminded you that we have already announced a policy commitment to move to 3% target of GDP for our expenditure on R&D. Now, some would say, well, a lot of countries already do it. That's true. But for this country, that remains quite a substantial and very ambitious program, and will require substantial shift in the political priorities of this country. And it shouldn't be underestimated how hard that is. And that's why I commended Bill Shorten for making that commitment. I can say this to you as Minister and government for almost 6 years, I found it almost impossible to get a commitment of that type while we were in government. And sometimes in oppositions, if there is any advantage in opposition at all, and I can think of very few elements, it's being able to say things like that, which then become election commitments, which of course moves the whole debate once you do win an election. Now, I'm especially concerned at the directions that have taken root in this government around the issues of commercialisation. And I think Professor Chubb made the point, well, we can't have an approach to science that sees science as an end in itself, that we've got to have a broader understanding of the political and social uses of science, that relationship between science and the great public institutions of this country and the people of this country. Now, that's an ongoing debate. But I think what's happened in recent times, while we can acknowledge that there has been in the past an undue understanding of the commercial aspects of science, the shift now towards this commercialisation approach that we're seeing will produce an unbalanced result. And it's not just within the CSIRO, and I'll have words to say about the CSIRO in a moment, but you're seeing an approach in the CRC program in regard to the block funding of research programs, a pattern emerging through all of those, where there's far too great an emphasis on the commercial impact of research without regard to the generation of new ideas and understanding of the world in which we live. Now, this is a pattern we saw in the Howard government. It's not new. It's the nature of a political divide in this country. Conservatives see the world as about the uses of the state for the service of business, a very narrow concept of business, and Labor tends to look at the issues in regard to the broader social and economic questions. Now, either side of the debate doesn't get that balance right, that the proportions right, as someone said before, but there is this fundamental divide about the approach that we take in politics. Now, I'm especially concerned about what's happening within the CSIRO. I've long been a champion of CSIRO. It is our premier scientific agency in the country. And I think the notion that it become a glorified consultancy is an abuse of public research agency of the calibre of the CSIRO. Now, I asked in the Senate estimates whether or not there'd been a reimposition of external funding targets. That was denied. I've seen the documents from inside the CSIRO which shows that that denial was misplaced, and we've had a correction to the record just yesterday, 9 days late. Those that work in the CSIRO know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not to say that we should not encourage our scientists to seek support from business. I am not opposed to business paying its way. In fact, I find it an offence that the state should constantly subsidise business in the way in which it so often occurs in this country and continues under these arrangements. What I say, though, it is wrong for an organisation like the CSIRO to impose an external funding target in such a way as it distorts the operations of the organisation. Because what we do know is the newfound business units, that's a new term that's been introduced under this government, the removal of the flagships and the divisional structures as we've understood them to business units. External funding targets have been imposed and the cuts have occurred in those areas which the documents say are not able to meet commercial criteria. So you impose the funding target, you don't meet it, you get cut. And then of course you're asked to pay for your redundancies that of course follow from it, from those same internal funding targets. Now I say that distorts the operations of an organisation. Now this was the same thing that happened under Howard. One of my first actions as Minister was to restore the public benefit provisions of the CRC program, which I note again have been taken away. So we do have to get a clear understanding of the general picture about what we're trying to do with our science, and that of course goes beyond just the quantums of money that we're providing. I am particularly concerned about what's happening in the Research Block Grant program. And I understand it in part relied on some reports from Professor Chubb. In part, I'd be surprised if he did recommend what actually occurred, whereby the movement away to fund university block grants on the basis of external revenue sources was always going to and will advantage the Group of Eight. And those, of course, that prosecuted the argument were often from universities other than the Group of Eight. I'll be surprised to find that the measures that have been put in place will reinforce the existing arrangements where the larger universities are able to attract more private money, and of course under this scheme it will increase the level of public support they get for that privilege. That measure will be reinforced under these policy positions. Now, I'm very concerned, therefore, that when we talk about the sort of discussions that you should be having with the political system, that you have a clear appreciation. It's not just about the money, but you can't ignore the money. You must also examine the philosophy that underpins the expenditure of that money. What we do know is that when people say the CSIRO, of course, an independent agency acting entirely without regard to the government's position, that's not true. I can assure you as Minister there are many things I'm able to do without direction, on the basis of having a conversation with the senior management of CSIRO. And some of the things that I cut were things that I actually welcomed as Minister. Support for manufacturing, social and economic research, cities research. These are the things that, of course, this regime doesn't like. They're the ones that can't attract the additional private income. They're the ones that get cut. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Senator. There might be a private citizen in the front row that might want to ask a question or a comment in a moment. But I might just ask a couple of questions and then open up to the floor. So the first question is, I'm a bit of a political tragic and a frustrated historian, and so looking at cabinet papers that are released and even previous policy positions from the 60s from the ALP showing that there are a number of concerns around career support for early career researchers. How do we support that? How do we get the funding mix between basic and applied research, and how do we get universities talking better to industry? Now, this seems to be a perennial problem. So is it a structural problem or a policy problem? Is it a cultural problem?
It's all of those things. You need government policies that are actually aimed at changing behaviour. Well, no one would argue the toss about that in terms of early career support, mid-career support, women in science. These are all measures that you can respond to with policy instruments, all of which we did. But in terms of the really big questions about the relationship between our scientists and the business community, and you look, for instance, at the revenue tables that are produced by the CSIRO. Well, they get about $1.2 billion in total revenue. The amount of money that actually comes from private companies of that is about 70 million. Of that, so the external revenue that the CSIRO relies upon is predominantly rechurned money from other government agencies. Now, so the answer for the CSIRO is not to rely on external revenue from other government agencies which have been cut as a result of the Commonwealth budget cuts, but it's to actually look at what is the relationship between the private sector and our science agencies. Now, one of the clearest areas of public policy that I think we could look at is the single most important policy instrument that we have for influencing business behaviour, and that's the R&D tax concession. Now, that's running, expect about $4 billion per annum within a year or so, maybe two. It's probably the single most important instrument we have of all the research programs. It's a lot more money than the ARC, HMRC, that all of those things, even the block grants are getting up around there. So it's a really, really big deal. And the provision that Finance and Treasury operate on the basis is because it's going up a lot, it has to be cut. Now, I'm suggesting that that approach in itself is wrong, because we do need to find the incentives to encourage business to invest in developing capacity, scientific capacity in this country. And I think that in regard to the fundamental issue about collaboration between the public and private sectors, the R&D tax concession remains the single most important instrument available to us as well. The fact that there's been so little discussion about a premium rate within the R&D tax concession strikes me as an area of policy failure. But to suggest that somehow or another we've got to screw all our grants and our public research agencies through to the idea that you only get rewarded if you're now working, or you substantially get, not only, but if you get substantially rewarded by working with a private company, strikes me to be incredibly short-sighted and will undermine this country's commitment to basic research. It will certainly undermine our commitment to the social sciences. Now, I'm very concerned about the long-term implications of that.
Okay. The other question I've got for you is, previous Science Meets Parliaments, both as a minister and as a shadow minister, you've challenged the sector to tell our stories clearer.
Yeah.
How do you think we're performing?
Not well. The fact is, Professor Chubb is one of the few outstanding science communicators that we have in this country on a consistent basis across the board. Part of the difficulty, of course, as I've said to you on so many occasions now, is that the work that people do is often in a very narrow field. The recent commentary about the CSIRO has been a bit of an exception, but a lot of that was international. And it was groups of scientists coming together to say, hang on a minute, this is just not right. The fact that you had to have so many people from oceanography in America arguing the position attracted considerable media attention. So I think, yes, there are areas that has been done reasonably well, but in general terms, I still don't believe the public has a firm understanding of why it is important for governments to invest in science. And now that Professor Chubb is a private citizen, I'm looking forward to a broader discussion on matters of public interest.
Do we have any questions from the floor? Just down here. Just down here, one. Needs the exercise.
Good morning. My name's Caitlin. I'm from Anstow. One of the things that I have noticed, and I think a lot of people have noted recently, is that the proportion of our elected representatives who have a STEM background is substantially lower than the proportion in the population. Do you think there would be value in increasing the number of elected representatives who have a STEM background? And if so, from your experience on the inside, how can people from those disciplines be attracted to that job?
Well, there's no prohibition against people with scientific training standing for Parliament, nor is there a prohibition on their engagement in the political process through the political parties. And it doesn't mean they're the only ones that are qualified to talk on these issues. And of course, it would be great to have more people engaged in a broader political debate amongst all different classes of citizens. But it's not likely to occur that we'll have reserved seats for scientists. So you're going to have to engage in the hurly-burly along with everyone else.
Hi, Stephanie Downs from the Antarctic Climate and Ecosystem CRC in Hobart. So there's been a lot of talk about researchers interacting with industry as we progress into the future for the National Innovation and Science Agenda. What about stepping back into, let's say, in the undergraduate degrees and actually making it mandatory to include policy and business, even in a minor way, in the
Thank you very much.
degrees? I think that would be far more important, and
Yeah.
similarly including science into the business schools.
There is enormous scope, again, for policy change here for undergraduate students in all fields to undertake what I call industrial experience. Now, I have a very broad definition of industry in that case. Some universities already are doing this, but I think it should be a requirement to have internships and the like where people go out and work within community and commercial organisations. It will give a much better understanding of how other people see problems, and of course would provide, I think, greater opportunities for university students to talk to other people about how they see problems. Now, of course, it occurs in engineering, it occurs in teaching, in nursing, but I think it should be more formalised throughout the education system.
Yes, I just wanted to ask, really wanted to get round to the position of the societies, the learned societies, who, in their own way and outside of government, are championing the cause of a group of people with science qualifications pursuing their profession in their own way rather than through the large employers. Part of the problem is that, let's say, in the minor, the professions like mathematics or statistics, there are big employers and then you're on your own. This has, within the societies, we can actually build up a sense of a professional life, and that actually goes back to what motivates people to take on science in the first place. And that also says what sort of education we're actually giving in science and whether it's entirely instrumental. Is it about being able to do really great things with big instruments, or is it or is it getting a sense of the world? Is there a sort of a cultural element to science education? I'm thinking particularly about professional ethics in science, which I think all of us probably in the back of our minds have in the same way that teachers and nurses and policemen have. Do you see, from a political point of view, there's some point in emphasising the, if you like, the professional culture of science as well as saying its instrumental value?
Well, I think scientific method, the way in which we undertake our educational system does discourage people from broader social engagements. You tend to work in smaller groups and you tend to be, I think, well, there's no great encouragement to go and argue the case in a more public arena. I've suggested, though, that we do need to put a lot more energy in terms of our PhD training on industrial PhDs and the like, so that we get a different approach to one that operates at the moment. And if you think about what happens in Europe, you think about particularly in Germany, you see a very different level of engagement with industry, and in particular because industry employs people. Yeah. You know, this idea that it's a one-way street, that only the academy's got to go out and explain itself to industry, I think is a wrong approach. There has to be an approach from industry that actually values the employment of people, particularly at the postgraduate level.
I'm Jenny Fisher from the University of Wollongong. I wanted to thank you first for your support of our colleagues at CSIRO. And I wanted to come back to what you were saying about us as a community coming out. You know, from our perspective, both we were blindsided by the cuts, but we also sort of did what we could with press releases and Twitter and contacting our international colleagues. I'm just wondering if you have any specific actions that in future situations like this we could take as scientists to try to support the science in our community.
Well, I want to thank all those that are sending me very detailed emails. I really do appreciate the level of science communication that's involved with that. And particularly when those who watch the estimates and see that answers are given which they don't agree with, and are pointing out the documentary evidence as to why that is incorrect. That's the sort of work that you can do without endangering yourself, I might remind you. And we respect the confidentiality of those communications, but that's exactly the sort of work that can be done. I've often recommended to you work through your union, because there are quite serious penalties for people who speak out on some matters. And don't be naive about this. All right? The threats of legal action have been very widely displayed in recent times. So just be very cautious about that aspect. But the union is there for a purpose. Your politicians are there for a purpose. There are an infinite range of folks that you could talk to if you feel that you can't directly communicate with me. But I would be delighted if you do, in fact, communicate with me.
I'd probably also make a comment around last year with the NCRIS funding, the threats to cuts there. Could you comment around how broadly the sector there?
Oh, look, that is another example I should have picked up, and I think Katrina, I think, played a particularly important role on behalf of this organisation in mobilising it. But you see, these are the sorts of things that the groups do, that collective action is able to produce quite substantial results. You don't have to individually carry the load for this, but you do have good folk around who are able to take on the fight on your behalf, and I think that's to be welcomed. Now, that demonstrated what can be done, and that also demonstrates why it's so farcical. We now have these statements being made now, given the threats that were made within a few months of those news statements. Now, you don't look to give horse in the mouth. If the government wants to claim these things, good on them. I'm under no illusion as to what they mean. I'm under no illusions of what will happen if they do secure control of the Senate, if they get these electoral laws through. But you don't give up, you just find new ways of arguing your case.
Jim.
Senator Carr, Jim Piper from STA. I just wanted to take you back to the R&D tax concession, where you've argued that it shouldn't be arbitrarily constrained. I think there is a maybe widespread view, however, that a lot of it is not very well targeted, and indeed a very large fraction goes to relatively small money of usually quite profitable companies, and that's balance, and the innovation agenda, of course, is pushing for new industry startups and that sort of thing. I wonder if you have ideas about how the R&D tax concession could be better structured. I might observe also from personal experience that when you heard it last night, Andrew Stevens, mentioned the fact that companies are taking stuff in-house because that's the way the money flows. And in fact, there are aspects of how it works in practice that are actually anti-collaborative, respect, for example, to outsourcing to universities and so on.
Well, remember that there was a substantial review of the R&D tax concessions when I was minister. We introduced quite substantial changes. We said they should be reviewed around about now. But there has been a number of reviews. In fact, the program is under constant review, I think, if you'll find. My experience is the Finance and Treasury doesn't like the program very much because it grows so rapidly. This is in the context where they've never ever been able to actually assess or predict the growth rate, never ever been able to get it right. So I'm concerned that while there is no doubt that there is always a capacity to improve any public administration, I'm concerned not to use that as an excuse to actually withdraw support. Now, if it's an entitlement program and people are actually investing legitimately and not in some sort of rort, then people are entitled to their rights. So you should be cautious about just taking at face value claims of misbehaviour. Now, if what we are talking about is a way to actually ensure that genuine R&D is actually supported, and that by international standards, it actually, and this is a very important point because the business case for the investment here will rely upon often, particularly with the larger firms, on the international standards, then it's important that we are able to be competitive. Now, I don't take the view that because they're large companies, they're not entitled to support. They are the backbone of our new investments. And I think the scheme only has about 12,000 companies registered at the moment. So we could probably do with a few more registrations, not less. But remember, when you're looking at a large international firm, they can make, their investments are footloose. And the attractions that the Singapore government puts on the investments leave us for dead. Chinese, the Japanese. So we do have to find a mechanism that is internationally comparable. And we do have to attract investment. This is not going to happen by accident. This is giving the lie to this free market nonsense once again. We actually have to ask people to come and provide them with the advice where they want to come. So I'm concerned not to reduce capacity or reduce incentives which may see investment go offshore. Does that mean that we could do better? Well, of course we can, always. But I'm saying we should actually think about an additional method to do that, and that's through providing an incentive, putting what I call skin in the game, whereby big companies say, yes, it actually pays us to invest with universities or public research agencies, and it encourages the universities and public research agencies to seek out co-investment from companies because there is a financial incentive to do it. That, to me, is probably the most substantial way in which you're going to get behavioural change.
Yeah, 2 questions up here.
Thank you. Francine from the STA and the High Blood Pressure Research Council. You said before that you don't think the public really understands the importance of science. My question is, do you think that's something that the government can help us to improve? Is that a role as us as scientists that we need to improve the understanding? And if so, how do you propose we do so? And I'm asking because, for example, in the UK, the Heart Foundation receives a lot of more charity funding than we do in Australia. And is that a change in culture that we need to push?
Well, I mean, philanthropy is one area in which we can attract new investment. It's true. We don't have the same interests in the philanthropic trust in this country that they have in other countries. It could be because of taxation reasons, it could be for all sorts of things. Now, the best way to actually improve the position of science is to fight an election on it, which I think is going to happen. Now, our task will be to make it around the broader questions. I don't think it's just about startups, I can tell you. It's actually about transforming the whole economy and about the investment in in the fundamental capacities of our research community. The real danger in this environment is that we'll be just talking about the young boys and girls in black t-shirts, the gold chains and the skateboards, and not talking about what it requires to actually develop a competitive steel industry, or understanding new material science, where we can actually have serious levels of employment, not some get-rich-quick scheme for the White Shoe Brigade. That's where the real problem is going to be. How do you actually channel a debate to make it sufficiently broad and not just to narrow it down to the latest gimmick?
Carly Cook from Monash University. I'm a conservation biologist and I'm watching policy changes undermining protections to the environment all across the country. It seems to me that lobby groups and industry do a very good job of raising their voice for what they want to see in policy changes. Do you have any recommendations for us as scientists who are really concerned about the implications of these changes? How do we raise our voice to the same level, considering we don't?
Well, again, I come back to the point. You've got organisations. If you can't do it individually, go through organisations. And unions and organisations such as yours are appropriate bodies to actually then. But when they do it, support them. Because for the individuals that do actually speak on your behalf, there'll be enormous pressure on them. They need support to follow it through. And what you're doing here is part of that process. I never walk away from that, but it's the day-to-day struggles that really matter. And that's why this debate about what's happening in the CSIRO is so important. I noticed that CEO of CSIRO says that he was surprised about how political the job was. Well, why should you be? You know, these are fundamental questions about the future directions of the country. And I come back to the point, it's about who gets what, where and why. And that's about an argument, right, as to what you've got to mount, why it should be you, not someone else.
And certainly the conversations that you'll be having today is part of that individual interaction that you can have as part of that process. And it's also about that follow-up as well as an individual, but also through the societies and broader communities. I think we'll have time for one more question.
My name's Keith Bristow and I'm with CSIRO. I just wanted to endorse some of the comments around the need to invest in all elements of the research spectrum. And I guess I've worked mainly in the basic and applied areas, but I was privileged to get into the CSIRO acceleration program, the first one, and went through that process. It was an absolutely amazing, fantastic experience and taught us a lot of things about how to do our science better and how to use that to deliver better impact. So getting across that spectrum, I think, is really something we need to invest in. And what it's done for me is it said I've got to go back and work harder at some of the basic research because it's identified the gaps where we kind of weak on and getting to the commercialisation. And one of my recommendations coming out of the course is to try and get more of our young scientists exposed to some of those programs early, because it'll give you really advantage as you do your basic and applied work and the link with delivery out in broader impact. So just a comment around that. Thank you.
I think he's after a comment around that.
Well, I have a view that the CSIRO is not just an applied science agency. It has a very important role in basic research. And you know, there's too many people in this room to try and tell you with examples, but it is a really important principle for politicians to understand. And it's not just there to help a few farmers and miners. What the documents show me is there's a deliberate shift into mining. I mean, one of the propositions that's advanced to us is that Northern Australia won't be affected by these changes. On what basis was that decision made? Other than the fact that it's a direct government policy priority. On what basis was it decided that mining should be given particular support and manufacturing reduced or oceanography reduced? These are political decisions that are made. That's why I say you've got to engage. Otherwise, the decisions will be made by other people and you may not necessarily like what comes out.
I think on that note, we'll thank the
Thank you very
Senator.
much.
Thank you.